Okay, round two, we're back.
Chittim, or those ships of Cyprus, or that Cyprus fleet, or that Chittim. All right. Hello,
hi, Guy.
everybody.
Welcome back. Hi, Jay. Good to see you, mate.
Brainerd here with another live stream for Sooth Keep. This evening, we are going to be covering Mystery Babylon for the third and final time. And this evening, we're going to be covering the subject of the little horn, hence the title, Mystery Babylon, Is America the Little Horn? As always, gives me a thumbs up if you can see and hear me. Hopefully everything is going to be A-OK. I do have my microphone on tonight. To start with, I want to have a couple points here of housekeeping. Mostly, I just want to ask you to pray for me. The next 2 months are going to be insanely busy, folks. I have, 4 trips coming up in the next 2 months. Some of them are pretty lengthy, extensive trips. So on top of that, I'm writing 2 books at the same time, plus trying to do live streams and videos. So it's going to be very hectic pace. I just ask that you pray for me, that God will give me grace and I'll get everything accomplished that needs to be accomplished. The second thing I'm asking prayer for is my wife is leaving this week for Brazil for 3 weeks. So I'm going to be batching it. She's going to be with our son and our daughter-in-law in the Amazon jungle, visiting their work down there. So just keep us both in prayer, please. All right. Well, the subject tonight, as I mentioned, is Mystery Babylon, particularly the Little Horn. Is America the Little Horn? Now, I'm not going to be presenting my view here tonight as if I'm teaching absolute dogmatic authoritative truth. I don't have as much certainty on the Little Horn being America as I do have on the truth of the pre-tribulation rapture or literal Antichrist and doctrines of that nature. But I do have a relatively strong degree of certainty on it, but it's not absolute certainty. And I do want to point out that no matter who we conclude that Mystery Babylon is, even if we conclude that it's literal historical Babylon in the plains of Shinar, no matter what we conclude, folks, on this subject, we are dealing a little bit with extrapolation, with inference, and with deduction. We can't escape it. That's just the way this topic has been presented to us. So, but I do want to point out that the conclusions I'm going to point out tonight, my own personal conclusions here, this is not mere speculation. Yes, it is a little bit of deduction and inference, but it's beyond mere wild speculation. I think there's actually some good, strong reason here. Many good men agree with this view, and I think you're going to see that this view has a lot going for it. So let's move on with the subject. And I want to start by making sure, as part of a foundation for tonight, that we understand the beast and the little horn and their relationship. Because if we don't understand the relationship between the beast and the little horn, then we're going to have a hard time wrapping our mind around America's involvement, if she is indeed involved, like I think, in the last days. So let's turn to Daniel 7:8, and I'm going to bring...
She can't not be involved in the last days. She's the biggest Christian nation on the planet. But does she turn... What does that actually mean, though? Is she in the Bible? Is she going to be the little horn? This guy's pretty thorough. He knows his stuff.
That passage up right away. And I see that I have a message here already, so I'm going to go check that message. Okay, the messages I have, they're just questions for later on, so we can get to them later on. So I'm not going to worry about that now. Let's bring up my Chrome tab here. And we're going to be looking at Daniel 7:8. I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were pulled up by the roots. And there, in this horn, were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great.
Oh, man, it's glowing. Hang on, guys, I'm going to readjust it.
Okay, so now with this passage here, what we see is there's a little horn that comes up amongst the 10 horns, and the 10 horns are on the head of the beast. So these 10 horns are the head of the beast. These 10 horns are dominating the beast, and the beast is the Roman Empire. Now, this doesn't have to be the exact same piece of territory that was the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago at the height of the Roman Empire in its original form. But it does have to have organic relationship to that Roman Empire. It has to bear a strong resemblance to it. It can have additional territory. It can add colonies to it, but it has to have the same essential footprint. Now, I want to point out that there's 10 horns that are part of this beast. After those 10 horns, which are the same as the 10 toes that we see in Daniel chapter 2 with the great image. After those 10 horns come up, there's a little horn that comes up. This little horn is not one of the 10, it's an 11th. And this little horn is somehow has organic relationship to the Roman Empire, but it becomes a part of the Roman Empire after the Roman Empire splits into 2 pieces, and after the 2 pieces split into 5 pieces each, then this little horn arises. So bear that in mind. Because if America is involved in the Roman Empire of the last days, America is not the Roman Empire. And America, therefore, is not Babylon as a whole. If America is involved in this picture at all, she can only be involved as the little horn, as something that comes up after the fractured Roman Empire and dominates the Roman Empire. And then she is Babylon in Revelation 18, only in the sense that she's the head or the little horn that dominates the whole beast. So anyway, if you can understand this, then I think you can wrap your mind around how
Welcome back,
America
Shawnee.
can indeed be involved in the Roman Empire and in Babylon in the last days. Now, I also want to briefly review here why Babylon is not literal Babylon. I'm going to give you 5 brief review reasons tonight. It's not the entirety of all the material that I presented in my first Mystery Babylon video. And if you need to review that, you're perfectly at liberty to go back at another time and review those arguments. But I'll give you 5 basic ones right now. The first one is that the final form of the Roman Empire is one and the same with Babylon. You have to understand that. When we see Babylon in Revelation 18, this is not a unique entity that's distinct from the 4th beast. It's not distinct from the feet of iron with the toes of iron and clay. It's the same thing. The only difference is this is looking at it from the fact that it's the mystery of Babylon, the mystery of iniquity that's been coming down in
Prayers for the family, Shawnee.
Infiltrating the whole world since the Tower of Babel and Nimrod, and it went through all of the
I thought
nations
you
or
meant
the empires
COVID.
of the great image, starting with the head of gold, which is Babylon, then the chest and arms of silver, which was Medo-Persia, then the belly and of
Doggy, you
brass,
making the camera
which was
rock.
the Greek Empire, and then the buttocks and the legs of iron, which was the Roman Empire, which ultimately divided. Ultimately, this Babylonian spirit ends up in the feet and then ends up in the toes at the very end of the age. And it's that final form of Babylon, which is destroyed by the Lord. We see that in Daniel chapter 2, that great rock that's cut out, not with hands, and it comes down from heaven and it destroys the entire image. It hits it on the feet, but destroys the entire image. So at any rate, this argument shows us that Babylon is organically connected to Rome. It's the same thing as Rome. It's the same thing as the final form of the Roman Empire. They're not distinct. Once you understand that, then it's easy for you to wrap your mind around the fact that Babylon here in Romans 8 or Revelation 18 cannot be the literal historical city of Babylon. The literal historical city of Babylon, while it was a part of the Parthian Empire, and while the Romans fought the Parthians on a few occasions and temporarily took some Parthian territory, Babylon was never a formally annexed part of the Roman Empire. No part of the Parthian Empire was ever a formally annexed part of the Roman Empire. They just temporarily held territory in the middle of some regional skirmishes, and then the two parties ironed their difficulties out, and they maintained the Euphrates River as the boundary between the Roman Empire and the Parthian Empire. So if Babylon was never part of the Roman Empire, and it was never annexed as a part of the Roman Empire, and it was never really a colony of the Roman Empire, then it can't be part of the Roman Empire in the last days. The second point is to see Babylon rebuilt after the rapture and maybe going into the 70th week, and it's going to be destroyed in the 70th week. So even if we give it 10 years from the rapture until its destruction, we're really still have, it's a really long shot. In fact, I think it's long enough to legitimately call it far-fetched, really, to think that this city of Babylon is going to go from what it is now to the most powerful economic city on the planet, be the global economic powerhouse, the head of the great shipping, the head of the great trade, the head of the great economic and commercial centers, the big banks, the big financial institutions. On top of that, you know, you'd have to dredge out over 100 miles of Euphrates River to handle the ocean-going shipping. You'd have to put in a massive harbor. There's just so much that would have to be done. And all the infrastructure that goes along with a big shipping port, including rail facilities and highway facilities and trucking facilities and airport facilities, it just gets really out of hand in a hurry. And when you stop and think of how long it took Israel to rise from her beginning to a world economic powerhouse, or China to rise, or America to rise, these things don't happen in a decade. And I doubt that it's going to happen in a decade in the future. The third point here is that Babylon did cease to exist in history. It's simply not true that Babylon has never ceased to exist. Now, Babylon hasn't seen the absolute destruction of the kind that's described in the Old Testament in the book of Revelation, but that kind of destruction can be fulfilled by a spiritual Babylon just as well as it can be by the literal historical Babylon. And to understand that the literal historical Babylon really did cease to exist, all you have to do is read the ancient Roman historians like Dio Cassius, gives his account of Trajan visiting there around 115 AD, and there was no city. He found a few blocks of stone in a little rubble, covered with sand. There was no city there. There was no trace of a city, not even a village. So the last point here then, and I guess I have 4 points instead of 5 because I consolidated 2. In Revelation 17:5, we read, "Upon her forehead is written her mystery name, Babylon the Great." And folks, this is in my mind, this is the best translation. This is really what this passage is saying, and I'll read it again. Upon her forehead is written her mystery name, Babylon the Great. This mystery Babylon is the final repository or the final depository of the Babylonian mystery of iniquity that started with Babel and Nimrod, and it's gone through all those nations, all the way through the 4 empires at the times of the Gentiles, and it is going to wind up with the final form of the Roman Empire in the last days, both the Rome aspect in Revelation 17 and what I regard as the America aspect in Revelation chapter 18. America would be the political and economic aspect. Rome would be the religious aspect. The religious aspect gets put away, folks, in the middle of the 70th week, the beast gets tired of carrying the woman who rides the beast and hates her and burns her flesh with fire. So at any rate, those are the reasons why I feel that Babylon can't be literal Babylon and why we need to be looking for a spiritual Babylon. The last one is that
Well,
the
he must
Bible
got hit
claims
hard,
that
mate.
her mystery name is Babylon. Another point that I think is really going to be helpful to get our mind to be able to wrestle with this whole subject and to make some sense out of things that are very difficult for some to understand is that when we're talking a figurative or a symbolic city of Babylon here, we are not going contrary to literal interpretation.
Shawnee, he's injured that bad you have to pray for him. Prayers for him too then, brother.
This is a big mistake that some people make. Let me explain how this works. I think people are making an effort to beg the question. They start out by pointing out that the historical city of Babylon is literal Babylon. And that if you're going to talk about Rome or America being Babylon, we've gone to figurative language. Well, folks, this is exactly true. I'm not going to deny it. It is true. If we're talking historical literal Babylon versus Rome being Babylon, yes, we're talking Rome as Babylon is figurative language. There's nothing to dispute there, but there's nothing wrong there either. See, what's going on is people take the observation that calling Rome Babylon or calling America Babylon or calling Washington, D.C. / New York City Babylon, that's figurative. But then which is a true observation. But going from there, they do a subtle sleight of hand. They change their hands just like a magician on the stage. And they subtly shift into trying to make a distinction between allegorical interpretation or the allegorical hermeneutic and the literal hermeneutic. And folks, this is not correct. You cannot do that. Because the question that we need to face here is whether we're looking at literal or figurative literal. Both of them are literal. We're not looking at a choice here between the literal hermeneutic and the allegorical hermeneutic. We're looking at a choice inside the literal hermeneutic. Inside the literal hermeneutic, you have sometimes things are literal and sometimes things are figurative. Both are equally at home in the literal hermeneutic. Now, let me help you walk through this a little bit so that you can wrap your mind around what I'm trying to say. The difference between the literal hermeneutic and the allegorical hermeneutic is not the use of figurative language. The difference is that under the literal hermeneutic, we take everything literal unless we have really strong reasons to take them figurative. Like it doesn't make sense unless you go figurative, or unless it's clear that God intended for it to be taken in a figurative way. But when you go to the allegorical hermeneutic, now you're taking things figuratively that can easily be taken literally. So hopefully you can understand what I'm trying to communicate here. What I'm saying is that if we look at Rome in chapter 17 is spiritual Babylon, and Washington, D.C. / New York City, or whatever you're going to call that, in Revelation 18 is spiritual Babylon, that even though that's figurative language, it still is perfectly within the confines of the literal hermeneutic and literal interpretation. If you have any more questions on that, feel free at the end of this presentation to ask some questions on literal interpretation. I'll be very glad to help you out. Now, let's go to one of the biggest arguments that people like to make against a spiritual understanding of Babylon, especially that this might be Washington, D.C. / New York City, or as the head of America. All right. They like to say that America is not mentioned in Bible prophecy. It's just not mentioned. But here we have to raise a question. Well, hold on. What are you saying when you say it's not mentioned? Are you saying it's not explicitly mentioned? Okay, I'll grant you that. Are you saying it's not mentioned at all? I can't grant you that. And I'm going to explain why. To say that something is not explicitly mentioned is not the same thing as saying it's not mentioned at all. There's a strong pattern in Scripture for significant players in Bible prophecy being described rather than explicitly named. And let's just look at a few things here. When we first run into the Greek Empire in Daniel chapter 2, we see the great image. And all we see is that there's a head of gold, which is identified as Babylon. And then we see the chest and arms of silver. And then we see the third empire, which is brass. But at this point in time, that third empire is not named. And anyone at this point in history that's trying to speculate who that third empire might be doesn't really have enough information to identify that third empire. Later on in the first year of Belshazzar, we have another vision. This
Hi, Kim, welcome back.
Daniel, and he dreamed about the four empires again, and this time he saw the third empire as a leopard with four wings. It was an interesting beast. But still, again, at this point in time in history, he doesn't know the identity of this beast. He doesn't have enough information to identify it, and nobody that's reading the passage has enough information to identify it. However, people would be interested in knowing who it is. When we get 2 years later in Daniel chapter 8, we see in the third year of Belshazzar that Daniel had a vision, and this one was of the goat and the ram. And here the goat is specifically identified as the empire of Greece. Now,
Yeah.
we're looking back with 2020 hindsight, and we're
Yeah, Vast left a comment on two streams ago saying that was when he had one more night over his head. I don't know where he is now. We haven't seen him for 2 days, so let's pray he got a house, guys.
we're fully absorbed in ancient history. At least some
Hey,
of us
Susan,
are.
good
The
to
rest
see
of
ya.
us are following the teachers that they respect, and we have this general understanding of the Greek Empire. But it wasn't so easy if you were back in the days of the rise of the Greek Empire. I want to point out here, can you imagine what it'd be like sitting around in a coffee shop in Jerusalem around the time of the
Yes, Kim, we agree on that as well. We are in the clays and toes time.
risings of the what became the Greek Empire, and you're debating whether this young upstart in Macedon could possibly be the rise of this third empire, which has already been said to be Greece. Now, I want you to imagine what they have to weigh with, because in their mind they're thinking of the classic map of Greek, and they see the different areas and regions of Greece. They see Boeotia, they see Thessaly, they see the different nation regions in Greece. But they also, in their mind, they know that Macedonia wasn't part of the original Greek Empire, wasn't part of those original nation states. It was a colony that later was expanded up in the northwest. So you can see them kicking this idea around, and some of them might be saying, well, I think the Macedon is Greek enough that it could, rise up and really take over the whole Greek Empire and be the Greek Empire. And someone else say, no, it's just not Greek enough. It's Macedon. It's not Greece. The Bible says Greece. So you can see that they'd have to wrestle with this subject. But even later on, when Macedon, through Alexander the Great, has conquered all the other Greek states and formed the Greek Empire, and now he's marching against the Persians. So I can see them, let's say in 335 BC and going into 334 BC, when Alexander the Great's marching his army against the Persians. I can see these same experts sitting in the same coffee bar, kicking this stuff around and thinking, Well, he did somehow manage to take the entire Greek Empire. I mean, I didn't see it coming because it was Macedon and not Greece, and not one of the original Greek states. But okay, this is the way it goes. It was a colony of Greece that took it over. Okay, I can see that. But still, when you look at the size of Alexander's army, I mean, it's untested against all these foreign armies. And I mean, the Persian army's over 2 million men strong. That's more than 10 times bigger than Alexander's army with all of his auxiliaries. So how in the world is he going to stand a ghost of a chance? You know, and so maybe another expert say, yeah, I kind of thinking that myself. I think that we're probably going to see the Persian Empire just kind of fade away slowly. And maybe the Greek Empire will get a little bit stronger and chew off a little bit more territory and eventually be strong enough to take Persia. Well, this was all legitimate speculation, but it was also all just speculation. Ultimately, what happened? That little upstart colony that took over the rest of the Greek Empire actually did become the head of the Greek Empire. So we have an analogy here, folks. I want you to think about this. The upstart colony takes over the whole rest of the Greek Empire and becomes the Greek Empire. And I think this is what we're going to see happening when we come to the time of the 10 horns and the little horn rises up and the upstart little colony takes over the whole of the Roman Empire. And I think that's what we're going to see in the last days. And I think we've already seen a few indications of this by analogy in history. At any rate, ultimately, we know what happened. Persia got stomped at Granicus in 334 BC. And they got stomped at Issus, and they got stomped another time. I forget the name of that battle, but ultimately they won their 3 major victories. They basically took over the entire Persian Empire. And it really wasn't that big of a fight. It's better to be fast and mean and strong than it is to be big and bulky. But let's move and look at the Roman Empire here, because I think we have another strong analogy here for what's going to happen in the last days. Rome, folks, I want to point this out. In all these prophecies in Daniel, Rome was never explicitly named. It was identified by bits and pieces of identifying information that when it finally came around where the Roman Empire did conquer the Greek Empire, by the time that happened, men who already had some foresight into Bible prophecy had already put 2 and 2 together and figured out this rising upstart Roman Empire over here, I think this is going to be the 4th beast.
Wow.
Or I think it's a great candidate for the 4th beast. So that I think by the time that we see the Roman Empire about 191 BC chasing the Seleucid Greeks out of Egypt. No, that wasn't a 191 BC, folks. That was a little later. I'm thinking of, it was in 191 BC when the Romans chased the Seleucids out of Thrace, and it was in the 160s or when the Romans chased the Seleucids out of Egypt. But at either rate, I can see prescient men when the Romans chased the Greeks out of Thrace in around 190, 191 BC, that those men would say, you know what, I think that this Roman Empire might be the one that's going to take over the Greek Empire. And probably that was a really strengthened insight when I think it was around 160 something BC that the Seleucids went down and took over Egypt from the Ptolemies, and then the Romans stepped in and said, nope, you get out of here because we're claiming this piece of territory. And the Romans booted the Seleucid household out, and that was led up to the time when Antiochus Epiphanes got all angry and dealt severely in Israel, and we have the typology of the Antichrist, but that's another story. One more piece of Roman information here that helps us to see how this material works and how we can have something be identified without being named. And that's it. In Daniel 11:30, we read about the ships of Chittim. Some versions say the ships of Cyprus. It doesn't really matter which way you go with the translation. But when this was first written, nobody would have read that phrase and understood it was a reference to the Romans. They wouldn't have known what to do with it. But when the prophecy was fulfilled, it was obvious that it was a reference to the Romans. And this happened in the 160 somewhere. I don't recollect the exact date, the 160 BC. But the Romans had a fleet in the area of Chittim, or the area of Cyprus, and it was a pretty strong naval fleet.
I'm going to check that link out when I hang up, Di. That looks interesting.
And those ships of Chittim, or those ships of Cyprus, or that Cyprus fleet, or that Chittim fleet.
Yeah, I missed it. Thanks for reposting it.
The Seleucids in Egypt, and forced the Seleucids to evacuate Egypt and go back north. And to say here the phrase like the ships of Chittim or the ships of Cyprus, this is like saying the Pacific fleet or the Mediterranean fleet. That's very similar to what it's saying. And if you talked about the Med fleet, people are going to understand you're talking of the American fleet. And if they're talking about the Pacific fleet, they're probably going to understand you're talking about the American fleet that's in the Pacific. We're the only nation on earth that has enough aircraft carriers to have a Pacific fleet, an Atlantic fleet, and a Med fleet, and etc. You get where I'm going with this. We actually have 10 aircraft carriers of the ultimate class, and nobody else on earth has a ready-to-go combat ultra class aircraft carrier. China has one. It's getting close to finishing, but it's not ready for the high seas yet, and it'll still be a few years. They're running into difficulties with their high tech and their big ship. Well, ultimately with this Roman stuff, once you get to 146 BC, and the Rome conquered the last of the holdout Greek cities. At this point, you didn't need to be real insightful in Bible prophecy to figure out that the Roman Empire was the fourth beast. Now, if you'd have figured that out in 160 BC or 190 BC, decades ahead of time, you'd have been someone with a lot of prophetic savvy. But once you get to the fact that Rome actually did conquer the last of the Greek cities around 146 BC, now it's just, this is just something that's obvious to everybody. This is like reading the news headlines and saying, okay, that's true. But here's another area where I think we need to wrap our minds around to understand why it's okay to have.
Wow, he charged $25 for it. Wow.
America being Bible prophecy without specifically being.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to watching it, Shawnee. Me too.
Since when we go to the first seal, everybody understands here the rider on this white horse is the Antichrist. Well, maybe not everybody. I think some people tend to think it's merely just the Antichrist spirit. And there's a few folks that get really messed up and they think it's actually the Lord who's riding the white horse. And I kind of pity those folks, because if that's the Lord Jesus, he's hanging around with some really bad company. So anyway, that is the Antichrist, folks. And it doesn't tell us it's the Antichrist. But people that have a spiritual understanding of the Antichrist teaching from the rest of the scriptures, and they put all that material together, when they come to this passage, it's plainly obvious that this is the rise of the Antichrist. And even there, I know that some people think that when it first is opened, it's only the spirit of the Antichrist. And I'm not convinced of that, folks. The spirit of the Antichrist is already here in the world. That spirit has been operating for a long, long time. And it doesn't just get released for the first time after the rapture of the church. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, the mystery of iniquity is already working, except for what? Except for the revelation of the man of sin himself. The rest of it's already there. You don't need a short period of time when you have the spirit of the Antichrist running, because that's already running. The only thing that's lacking is the Antichrist himself. At any rate, I think you can see where I'm going now. So why it's okay for us to have America in Bible prophecy when it's not specifically mentioned. Rome was never mentioned specifically in the prophecies, even though we know it's Rome. It's not even mentioned specifically in the book of Revelation.
Stop it, man.
So we will be able, just like folks were, if they were prescient, they probably recognized Greece, led by Macedon, as the third empire before it.
Well, Diane, that'll give him a lot of money YouTube ads if he's got 4.5 million.
Actually conquered the Persians. And those that had some spiritual insight into Bible prophecy probably put two and two together, and 20, 30 years, even 40, 50 years prior to the Romans actually overthrowing completely the Greek Empire. There was probably people that put two and two together and figured out that Rome is going to be the fourth beast. And it's in the same approach to scripture that we come to seeing America in Bible prophecy in the last days. Just like they followed the flow of history, they saw current developments, and they followed that flow of history to the present state, and they extrapolate to the future, and they say, if this keeps going, Greece is the third empire. If this keeps going, Rome is the fourth empire. In the same way, we look at history, we look at what's happened from the 1900 or even from the late 1800s up to the present day, the rise and growth of America being a superpower. And we say, if this keeps going, this looks like America is the final form of the fourth beast.
It does look like that.
All right. Now, let me give you the theory of why I believe that America can be legitimately considered as part of the Roman Empire. Let's start again by turning one more time to that passage in Daniel chapter 7 and verse 8. I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up from among them, before whom three of the first horns were pulled up by the roots. And there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great boasts. Now, I love this passage, and I've had my mind wrapped around this passage for several
It's clearing,
decades
guys.
now,
Hang on.
contemplating the possibility that America was actually going to be, in the last days, the final form of the Roman Empire. Now,
I'm trying to focus the camera.
just as the little horn was a newcomer to the Roman Empire in the Bible prophecies that arrives after the empire is divided into two and then divided into 10 toes, so it's late in history and dominates the 10 toes. I also want to point out that notice that it arises among the 10 toes. This tells us that the 10 toes already exist. This tells us that the 10 horns already exist. And this means, folks, that the little horn, whoever the little horn is, it arises after the Roman Empire split into two pieces in the 5th century AD. It can't be any empire or nation that rose prior to that. But also on top of that, after the empire split, the eastern half stayed one solid empire for about 1,000.
Shawnee, Henry Kissinger, I've seen him talking on some interview somewhere, and he said it's up to China to bring in a new world order. That's exactly what he said. This is about 10 years ago, maybe a bit longer.
Years, well, the western half fractured. So you've already early on the western half fractured. The eastern half was conquered by the Ottoman Empire in about 1453. And you go on from there for several centuries of a united Ottoman Empire. So that whole eastern part is still one piece. It's not broken up into toes. It doesn't have individual horns that are on the head of the beast, okay? Now, so wherever this little horn rises up, it has to rise up after or in the vicinity of the eastern half disintegrating and breaking up. Now let's look at the context in which America actually arose, and then we're going to look at the context of America's rise to power. Now, the context in which America rose, I don't know if you've thought about this or not before, but America was originally what? British colonies, French colonies, Spanish colonies. That was the primary source of America's territory. America, for all practical purposes, started as colonies from the last three superpowers of the fractured western part of the Roman Empire. You know, England was a world superpower for a while, France was a world superpower for a while, and Spain was a world superpower for a while. And they all maintained not necessarily a superpower status, but a pretty large power status for a long time afterwards. So America rose from the time of her birth into her growth into an adult. She arose out.
China owes a lot of America. I'm pretty sure China's got the lease of the Yellowstone National Park. They own a lot of land in America.
Of British, French, and Spanish colonies. Formed her own nation. Still had close relationships with those three, but she was
Ottoman Empire. Good name for a store, furniture store.
Surrounded by territory held by those three empires. If you recall, there was a time when the British Empire was, the sun never set on it. There was a time when France held a lot of territory in North America, but even after she relinquished her North American territory, she held a lot of territory in Africa and Asia and a little bit in South America. Spain held a whole bunch of territory in North America. When she relinquished the United States, she still held Spain, all of Central America, most of South America, and held a lot of territory in the Pacific Asian islands and a lot of territory in Africa. So these were massive empires still in many, many ways. And America rose in the middle of these empires. Now, ultimately, America beat all three of those nations in war. In fact, when we beat Spain in war, we received in return the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. So now I don't think that America defeating these three nations is a fulfillment of Daniel 7:8, where the little horn is going to just take over three nations in the last days. But I do think it's a prophetic analogy that has weight. Now, let's look at the context not merely of America's rise, but of America's rise to superpower status. America came out of nowhere, caught the world pretty much by surprise, because America had gone from 1850 up into the late 1800s, into the 1890s, pretty much on an isolationist platform. We were pretty much staying out of world politics. We'd already had our own Civil War. We'd settled that. After the Civil War and heading towards 1900, we became very powerful in trade, particularly with things like coal and steel. Now, in 1898, America fought a war. I think it started in like April and ended in August, maybe September, somewhere in there. Was not a very long war, and it was fought in both the Pacific and in the Caribbean and the Atlantic. But in this war, ultimately, we forced Spain to give up the fight. Spain let Cuba go. Cuba became an independent nation, but also we received the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico as American territories. And we still hold Puerto Rico and Guam. In 1946, the Philippines was granted their freedom after World War II. By the time we come to 1900 now, America was now a world superpower. We were recognized as one of the greatest powers of the planet. We'd already defeated what was regarded as one of the strongest militaries on the planet. We decisively whipped them. Our Navy was just entirely dominant. And the savvy and the ferociousness of the American troops on the ground was something the Spanish had never seen. At any rate, We also had the largest economy in the world at this point in time. We passed up the big players like England, and we had the largest gross domestic product per capita, the GDP per capita. And at this time now, in the Ottoman Empire, which had taken over the eastern half of the Roman Empire in 1453 when they sacked Constantinople, now the Ottoman Empire in the 1800s was already starting to fracture. They'd lost Greece, for instance, in a war that I think lasted like 1821 to 1829, something in there. And Greece won her independence, and there were other nations that separated or were chomping at the bit to be separated from the Ottoman Empire. And so the empire was already in a way starting to fracture. And it started to completely fracture in World War I. And at the close of World War I, the Ottoman Empire became history. It was officially dissolved. Turkey became its own independent nation, really distinct from the Ottoman Empire, even though the Turks had dominated the Ottoman Empire. And then there was a lot of other nations that became independent nations. And at this era is when the toes of the Eastern Empire really
They're all Freemasons. They're all Freemasons, Shawnee. You know that.
Started to come into clarity. Now, when we come into World War I, America enhanced the U.S.
Trudeau bowing to Z. Wow, well, there you go. Trudeau is a communist. He's Fidel Castro's son, after all.
Position as a superpower. And when we come out of the close of World War II, hands down, America was the world superpower. Nobody doubted it. Everybody knew it. So America cemented her legacy.
Sarcasm is lost when you text it, isn't it?
As a superpower. And by the way, though America has developed a lot of intrinsic weaknesses still in our current times, folks, you need to understand she still has the most dominant Navy and Air Force on the planet. And while our domination, I don't think on the battlefield for artillery and infantry is quite so decisive, I still think our military ground forces are the most dominant ground forces on the planet. At any rate, that's America's rise to superpower status.
Okay, he hasn't seen Russia kicking the Ukraine's ass then, has he? If he still thinks America fields the best army.
We're still there today. There are chinks in the system. There's weakness in the system, but we are still a dominant superpower.
Yeah,
now,
that's true.
America's current place in this whole structure is that the three nations that we've fought in the past and beat.
And Susan, that's the only problem I had with King Charles being the Antichrist. I seen him getting in trouble off the Rothschilds too. He was wagging his finger at him, and Charles put his head down. I saw that. So if he's the Antichrist, how does he bow to the Rothschild?
They're still powerful nations, there's no doubt about it, but not anywhere near what they were in their glorious days in the past. Spain and England and France have all diminished a bit. Now, France and Spain are still probably both, I think they're both on the top 10 militaries in the world, but they're far behind America, Russia, and China. Now, America still has the most powerful economy on the planet. Now, they're not the strongest growth economy on the planet. I think the strongest economy on the planet from a growth perspective is clearly China. But America still has the most dominant economy in the world. We have the most powerful Navy on the planet, hands down. We have the most powerful Air Force on the planet, hands down. There really is no competition. We have the military with the largest footprint in the world. We have the greatest global reach in the world. Nobody really has a reach that begins or compares to the American reach. So time is going to tell, folks. I mean, right now, when we look at the picture, to me, it looks very clear that America is the best choice for the final form or for the little horn that's going to head up and dominate the Roman Empire in the last days. It's going to dominate Babylon and be the head of Babylon of the last days. Things could change. We could be very pleasantly or very unpleasantly surprised. There's some very good men that think America is going to cease to be a dominant power in the world.
Susan, there's some pretty convincing evidence that King Charles is the Antichrist. I'm not saying he is, but there is some pretty convincing evidence. So how's he getting his finger wagged to him from the Rothschilds? Unless the Rothschilds got Satan in it already, and Satan will leave the Rothschild and enter Charles when Charles goes full blown. Maybe that's it.
Either prior to the rapture or shortly after the rapture or in association with the rapture. There's different scenarios that could be. I don't think any of us should discount that as a possibility, but personally, my belief is that that is not as likely as America being the little horn that dominates the Roman Empire in the last days and that becomes the head that exemplifies and represents Babylon in Revelation 18. Now, let me give you some points here where I see America as Babylon, things that I think make good, strong arguments for it. Again, now this is all inference and deduction, of course, but these points I think have merit, and they help bring into the forefront why I think America is the best option or best candidate that we have. First of all, I mentioned some of the spiritual analogies, and I'll just breeze through them again. For a spiritual analogy, the little horn takes over 3 of the 10. Well, folks, as a historical analogy, America has already beat 3 of the 10 biggest nations of the fractured Roman Empire. The last 3 superpowers of the western half of the Roman Empire. We beat Spain, we beat France, and we beat England. I want you to understand too that America did rise after the fractured Roman Empire. At the time that America was rising to be a superpower, the western half was already long fractured and the eastern half was fracturing. Here's another spiritual analogy, folks. Washington is one of the few cities on the planet that makes a reasonable claim to being a city that sits on 7 hills. This is a spiritual analogy to Rome being a city that sits on 7 hills. The 7 hills in Rome are Capitol Hill, Meridian Hill, Floral Hills, Forest Hills, Hillbrook, Hillcrest, and Knox Hill. There's other arguments that we can make for America here. Let's look at its domination, folks. New York City is the city that has made every other wealthy city on the planet wealthy. The only one that's a partial exception is London. London was already wealthy, but London's wealth has been enhanced by American wealth. And the rise to dominance of the New York Stock Exchange and the financial institutions in New York probably took a lot of growth and opportunity away from London that would have otherwise belonged in London. But London is really the only other super powerful city on the planet that isn't really a stepchild of New York City's financial institution. But at any rate, you look around all the great powerful banking systems in the world and the rise of the affluence in other nations that have become first world nations, and it's been largely influenced and helped by American trade, American technology, American dollars. It was American dollars in petroleum that brought the petroleum industry to the whole world, and that brought the whole world into the modern system that depends on petroleum. Here's another interesting point. When the Roman Empire was running strong, it had 2 official languages. Greek was the official language of commerce, and Latin was the official language of most of their transactions in the political realm in Rome. But they also used Greek for that because a lot of the nations that they were working with actually had Greek as their first language, and Latin was their second. When you come into the days of America, folks, just like Greek and Latin were the lingua franca of the ancient world. Koine Greek was the lingua franca of the whole known world. And that's why the New Testament was written in it. Now we come to the day when English is the lingua franca of the whole world. Virtually anywhere you go in the world, you can find people that speak English. And if you go to nations that have large trade associations with America, it's really easy to find people that speak English. English has become the Greek and Latin of our day. English is the lingua franca of the world. I think this is a strong argument for America being the superpower of Babylon in the last days, because America's language of English spread to the whole world because of commerce. I've already mentioned that America is the biggest superpower on the planet with no close seconds.
Diane, I'm so glad George Bush Sr. wasn't alive to see the New World Order come into existence. Sucko George Bush Sr., burn in hell, you old spider.
Here's another interesting one. America was the first government in the world to embrace across the board the whole Roman form of government and literally put it into practice in the same way that the Romans had put it into practice with the tricameral forms of government. We had the executive, the judicial, the legislative. They were to balance each other out. There already were a few nations that had three houses like that, but they were typically heavily weighted either to the executive side or heavily weighted to the legislative side. But in America, these things were much more equal.
Just blew half my brains out.
Now, and as Caesar was the most powerful man in the world in his day, so for many years or decades now, the American president has been the most powerful man in the world. That's being challenged a little bit right now, but I don't think it's been entirely erased.
I just blew half my
Here's some other
brains through my
interesting
nose.
points about America's part in this whole thing. And I don't go deep into this stuff myself because I leave other people whose whole life ministry is research into the secret societies and into the deep state and America's secret history. But if there's tons of books and tons of videos by
Hey, Shawnee, God bless, mate.
Go to research this subject deeper if you please. But folks, it's pretty easily demonstrable that America, the vision for America came from people who were part of the secret societies or the deep state in Europe, who came to realize they would never have a new world order established in Europe because no matter who rose to dominate in Europe, the rest of Europe wouldn't want to submit to them. So they came up with a vision to start a new world order or a nation to head the new world order in the new world. And that nation became America. And from the earliest days of America, back when we had our founding fathers' days, America's glory days, folks.
Oh, you're going too, Susan. Okay, good night, Suze.
These deep state people, these secret society members were already right in the thick of America. They were right part of its foundation. And while they allowed America to go down its own independent direction, heavily influenced by the Bible, the deep state people were using religion as the cocaine for the masses. They had their own plans. Now, another interesting thing, maybe some of you have investigated this, and some of you have probably investigated it even more deeply than I have. But Washington, D.C., folks, is laid out in a pentagram shape, and many of its great cultural features and its monuments and its most important buildings have features that have occultic significance, and that's not accidental. That was intentionally put there. The other thing I'd point out is the secret societies are deeply, deeply entrenched in Washington, D.C. and in New York City. Now, here's a couple more interesting points, folks. I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but the symbol of the Roman Empire was the eagle, and the symbol of America is the eagle. And also, America's culture has been deeply and tremendously influenced by ancient Greek and Roman culture. One more point that I think we need to look at as far as these things that really point to America as a good, strong candidate for being a Babylon in Revelation 18. America is represented by a city, mind you, not because America itself is not a city, and we do have a city there. And I think that city is the representative head of America. I would take it to be New York City in the sense of that entire megalopolis that starts from New York City and stretches all the way to Washington, D.C. But at any rate, America's place as the protectorate of Israel is really an important aspect too to take into consideration. Maybe you've never thought of this, but Israel has always been under the domination or protection of the Gentiles, of the four empires of the times of the Gentiles. Sometimes people think that it was under the domination of Rome when the Catholics had it, and then it was not under the domination of the Roman Empire when the Arabs had it. And folks, this is just not right. The eastern half of the empire was taken by the Arabs. There's no doubt about it. But it was still the eastern half of the empire. And Israel was always under either the western half or the eastern half of the Roman Empire, back and forth. It was never not under the Roman Empire. And I think this divided Roman Empire is ultimately where the feet or the toes of iron and clay are going to come in. The Islamic mindset in the Middle East, the Arab mindset, does not mingle with the religious and democratic mindset of those in Europe, whether they're coming from the Catholic perspective or whether they're coming from a more liberal political perspective. It just doesn't mingle, that concept of democracy. And I think these are the elements of iron and clay that don't mix. Now, there is an aspect that some have brought out. I'm not going to go into it tonight. It's really another topic. There's a legitimate consideration that the iron and clay that don't mix in the toes may have a Nephilim component, but I'm not going to go into that tonight. I think that's a deeper subject and it's a different subject. So I'll just mention it and let it go. Now, when the Arab Empire was eventually absorbed by the Ottoman Empire, completely taken up, so that one form of Arab government dominated the original forms of Arab government. And then when the Ottoman Empire lost control, France had control of Israel for a short while, and then the British had control of Israel for a little while. And then ultimately, even though America has never taken formal control and was never offered formal control, for all practical purposes, folks, America is Israel's main protector. We're her big brother, and we watch over her. We're dominating her. It's the Gentile superpower domination of the Roman Empire in its, in my estimation, final form. And while we're on this subject, I think it behooves us to mention that the United States was the first nation to recognize Jerusalem formally as Israel's capital and to put our embassy there. Now, I wish that more nations had followed, but America did step up. Now, I'd also point out that America has some strong friendships with Israel and with Saudi Arabia, and growing friendships with a few other nations there and relationships with other ones. Even though America's influence is not really enjoyed by some of the nations in the Middle East, we are still the most dominant player in the Middle East, and Russia is trying to give us a run for their money. Now, one more point on this, folks, and I want to point this out. Back in the 70s and 80s, we had a Saddam Hussein who was saw himself as Nebuchadnezzar's reincarnation, and he had a vision to rebuild Babylon, to rebuild the glory. And when he started rebuilding that city, folks, I'd tell my friends, they'd say, see, America's going to collapse. Europe is going to be the head of the Roman Empire, or Babylon is going to be the head of the Roman Empire. And they'd go down those kind of paths. And I would just Didn't want to, argue over the point, but I just tell my friends, I see it differently. I think the Roman Empire is going to destroy Babylon. And folks, that's exactly what happened. Babylon got beat up twice, literal historical Babylon. And the grandiose plan to build the literal historical city of Babylon never really materialized. It barely got off the ground, and now it's pretty much dead in the water. As I understand, there's still a few trinket sellers hanging out there once in a while, but that's about the end of it. So that pretty much wraps up my message, folks. It's a pretty short one here tonight. I went pretty fast, but that pretty much wraps up everything I had to say here. Let me just make a few concluding remarks, and one of them is I do want you to understand, I'm not putting this forth that I'm absolutely certain that America is the little horn. I'm just putting this out as America is the only nation on earth that I think fits the little horn. I don't see any other candidate.
Diane.
If any other candidate is going to come up, America has to be taken out of the way first. I honestly don't see that happening, folks, but there's some very, very good men that do. And even though I don't, if I was to be a betting man and put probabilities on this, I think it's a low probability, but I can't say there's no probability there. And I also want to point out that even if we manage to actually identify correctly the little horn, we do have to understand the context in which we did so. If we prove to be right on this someday, this was really an educated guess, folks. It wasn't absolute certainty. I'm just putting this out there in that I think that America is the only strong bet, the only reasonable candidate that we have in the world right now. If America is going to be taken out of the picture, somebody else can rise up. But if America is not taken out of the picture, it's pretty hard to imagine someone else rising up while America is still in the picture. So with that, I close my presentation, folks. And we'll just turn it over to the questions that my moderators have put up for me. So I'm going to go take my Facebook connection here and go to my questions. Okay. Question for Lee. All the Old Testament people from the Old Testament, after Jesus was crucified and went and preached to them, did they get their glorified bodies when they went to heaven with Jesus? I do not think they did, no. I think the Old Testament saints are going to get their glorified bodies at the second coming, so that all the Old Testament saints and all the tribulation martyrs will get their resurrection bodies at the same time. What do I think about the 3 flying objects? I think the objects that America has been seeing floating over, and it's my understanding now that there's been at least 5 or 6 of them, and I think they've shot 3 of them down, if I got my numbers correct, but things have been changing pretty quickly, so that might need to be updated. But I think these objects are just efforts by the Chinese government to test our resolve, to test our defenses, to test our resilience. Maybe there were some spying aspects involved with these. I don't really know. I haven't read anything about any technical equipment associated with these balloons being captured. Doesn't mean it hasn't been, but I haven't read anything on it. I don't think these are UFOs. Question: if God closed the door of the ark, who opened it, Noah or God? I would assume that God had to open the door if God shut the door. Can we be dogmatic about the white horse rider being the Antichrist and the other horses are not associated with literal individuals? Well, let me ask my own question. I think hell and death are 2 literal angels. I think the rider on the red horse is a literal angel. a very powerful literal angel. I think the rider on the fourth, the third and second, and all those, I think
they're exactly the right. I think they're angels as well. I think all the horsemen of the apocalypse, I think they're actual angels on each horse. I agree with him here.
they're actual riders on horses, literal beings. Could the four horsemen be similar to the horses in Zechariah? Similar, but I don't think they're identical. The four horses in Zechariah are doing a watch service on behalf of God rather than a judgment service on behalf of God. Is the Babylon spoken of in is the Babylon we talked about tonight the Babylon spoken of in Revelation 17? They're very closely related. They're both aspects of the Roman Empire divided. The Greek Empire divided, the Roman Empire divided. And when the Roman Empire divided, it just didn't divide into east and half, but we also had a division, particularly amongst the western half, of religious Babylon and then political economic Babylon. Will the church be gone when it falls? Yes, the church will be gone when religious Babylon is destroyed in the middle of the 70th week, and the church will be long gone when political economic Babylon is destroyed at the second coming. Are you saying the little horn could be referencing its age or youth as opposed to its size? Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying, yes. It came up earlier or after the fact, so it's not going to grow as tall. Doesn't have as long of a history. Revelation 12 talks about the eagle's wings protecting Israel. Could that be America? No, I think we need to get the typology of the eagle's wings from the Old Testament use of the eagle's wings, and that was God himself preserving Israel. So I think that's what it again will be in the book of Revelation. I think by the time we get that deep into the book of Revelation, America is no longer Israel's ally. We've already turned against Israel, begun persecuting Israel because we're part of the Roman Empire that's persecuting Israel. If we are what you say, how can Christianity thrive here? Well, that's a good question. But if you stop and think about it, in the early church, Christianity thrived in Rome for 3 centuries, thrived in the Roman Empire for 3 centuries. And the Roman Empire had 10 serious persecutions of the Christians. The first one started in the years of Nero, bloodthirsty persecution of believers, and the church thrived. So the fact of the matter is the church actually thrives better. Now, we don't thrive financially better. We don't have as exciting and as big of TV programs and exciting ministries when the church is under persecution. But if you want to talk about just not conversions and serious discipleship, the church is growing like wildfire in some parts of the world where there's serious persecution. So the persecution and the wickedness itself is not a hindrance to the church growth. But what's a hindrance to the church growth? Being pansy Christians. That's what's a hindrance to church growth. Being wishy-washy Christians that are too worldly. Folks, if God has given us the opportunity here in America to use our financial opportunities, to use our television and media opportunities, to use social media opportunities, to use all kinds of cool tools, use them while we can, exploit them while we have opportunity, because the day may come when all of this is taken from us. We got no guarantee we're not going to spend a year or two as an underground church before the rapture happens. I hope we don't have to face that, folks. I'm not looking for it, and I'm not even praying for it.
Okay, this is 7 months old, guys.
I'm a little
So he's suggesting the rapture could be a year or two away, which could be right.
Trustful of Christians that pray for persecution. I'm not going to pray for that. But folks, persecution would do us good. And we've got no guarantee we won't see some before the rapture. Are we not called to come out of Babylon? Yes, we are. We absolutely have an obligation.
We are doing that now by gathering here in Jesus' name. So we are coming out of Babylon. We don't participate in the worldly evil stuff.
To separate ourselves from spiritual Babylon. If you're in a church that is part of spiritual Babylon and you're there next Sunday, you've got some reckoning to do with the Lord. You should not stay in spiritual Babylon churches.
Yep.
Babylon nations, folks, is a different thing. When they're called to come out of the physical city of Babylon, this is coming out because judgment is falling.
Mm-hmm.
Right now. Get out now. This is similar to Lot
Sodom and
fleeing
Gomorrah.
Sodom. That's the kind of situation we're talking about.
He's right.
Well, what do you have to say about spiritual dark powers in the earth at this present time? Folks, I think most of us probably are, let me put it this way. I think most of us don't understand how deeply embroiled in spiritual warfare we really are. We probably are a little too superficial. We see it from the perspective of the doctrinal battles we face, and those are real battles. Those are valuable battles. But on the spiritual level, folks, there is spiritual iniquity in this country, and behind that spiritual iniquity is some absolutely insanely powerful, hateful,
He's right.
vicious devils in association with Satan himself. And the darkness is getting so thick here in America that I can taste it. I can taste it in the air. I can taste it every time I watch anything in the news or on television. And I'm sure that every godly person can taste it and feel it. Lee, can we end with the prayer tonight? We absolutely can do that. That's a good idea. What media source do you trust today? I don't trust any media source absolutely, but I've got a few that I trust as much as I can trust any man on the planet. I get a lot of my media news updates, folks, filtered. I don't go right to these news sources myself. I get them filtered so that I let someone else do the filtering. So I follow Amir Sarfati. I get a lot from Tom Hughes. I get a lot from my buddy Pete Garcia. I get stuff from times from Billy Crone, who does phenomenal research on some of these issues. I think Billy Crone's, I don't know, I think when the Lord made his brain, he must have accidentally pushed the brain button twice. At any rate, he's got a lot of good material. Are ICBM missiles described in Zechariah 5? No, I don't think so. Do you believe that the literal resurrection of the dead in Christ will cause a major shifting of the ground everywhere? I don't think it's going to cause a major shifting of the ground, but it could be associated with an earthquake, folks. It was in the Gospel of Matthew at the Lord's resurrection. What do I say when someone asks, why is God not visible? I'd ask them why electricity isn't visible. Where do I find hell and death are angels? Well, one of the things I think we're going to see hell and death cast into the eternal lake of fire. And I don't think that's talking about a physical chunk of planet Earth where hell was in a whole bunch of graves. I think that this is the angel of hell and the angel of death, along with all the beings that had been taken by hell and death, are going to be cast into hell. So I've wrapped up all the questions that were given to me in Facebook. We got a few more minutes here, folks, if anyone wants to send in a few more questions. I've enjoyed this time tonight, folks. I'm always glad that you all show up and you ask some great, great questions.
Mm-hmm.
So why don't we go ahead and oh, we got another question coming up here. I was going to say we could go into prayer, but if we got another question coming up, then we'll go ahead and. What are the strongest arguments for post-trib?
Good question.
In my mind, there are no strong arguments for post-trib, but the strongest ones that they have are just going to Matthew 24, for instance, and seeing saints going through the tribulation and saying, see, here the saints go through the tribulation. That's the strongest argument they have. But folks, I want to point out in Matthew 24, you have to follow the same rule of interpretation you follow everywhere else in the scriptures. The number one rule of interpretation is the same as real estate. In real estate, location, location, location is everything. I one time built a log home that was valued at about $220,000 at the time we finished it. It's valued close to $400,000 now. But if that log home was on lake property, it would be worth millions of dollars. Location is everything. And the same way in interpreting scripture, context is everything. When you're in context of Matthew 24, that passage is plainly addressed to Israelites living in Israel. It's not addressed to Montanans living in Montana, to Poles living in Poland. It's addressed to Israelites living in Israel. It's also addressed to people to whom God is holding accountable to the Sabbath. God says, pray ye that your flight be not on the Sabbath. This is God upholding the Sabbath. Folks, I am convinced that if you have a sober understanding of the gospel, you understand that he that has Christ is dead to the law. The law is a schoolmaster designed to bring men to Christ, was never designed to save, was never designed to be part of our breastplate of righteousness. Now, if you have God upholding the Sabbath, folks, we're not in the church age. We are back in the 70th week, and this is Israel under the law, just like she was under the law in the 69 weeks before. Same thing, we have the temple there is called the holy place. It's not the holy place now, and if the Jews built the temple today, it would be holy to them, but it would not be God's holy place. It's only going to be God's holy place when he removes the church, the spiritual temple, from earth and goes back to a physical temple. Then it will be his house again for 7 more years. And it's only when it's his holy place can there be a great tribulation. Because the great tribulation starts when the Antichrist sits in God's temple, the temple of God, not the temple man says is God's temple, the temple God owns is God's temple. That's when the Antichrist is committing abomination of desolation. I point out too that in Revelation chapter 11, just to throw some more context on Matthew 24, God measures the temple and owns the worshipers in it. Folks, this is not the church age. Every passage where you see saints in the time of tribulation, folks, you never see Christians. You see Messianic Jewish believers. You see the law. At any rate, Matthew 24 is the strongest argument for any kind of a post-trib rapture, and it's easily debunked. Okay, we got a whole bunch more questions come up now. Revelation 3:10 question. What happens to the demon?
Okay, guys, I was planning to hang up when he done the prayers, but I'm going to hang up now then. Thanks for joining, guys.